We really appreciate you joining us here this evening. My name is Ann Peters, and I'm visiting from Washington, D.C., where I'm the University and Community Outreach Director for the Pulitzer Center, a global journalism and education organization. And also, we're a very proud partner with the Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism. We've been longtime partners, and it's really exciting to be all together this evening. We greatly appreciate this partnership through which we've produced a range of community programs and reporting opportunities for students here at the school. Key among all of that is our shared commitment to the field of journalism and to supporting the most impactful stories of our times. I believe we are both eager to expand the impact of journalism by preparing new generations of diverse journalists to become exceptional fact finders and storytellers. I want to thank our Berkeley journalism and our Pulitzer Center colleagues who worked diligently to bring together this gender forum. I'd also like to thank you, our audience, for joining with us tonight. As a way to continue learning together, just a quick plug that there are QR codes here and outside that you could share with us your thoughts after this event on further programming we might do together. And earlier today, we brought together a wonderful panel of journalists, scholars, practitioners, and policy experts to focus on how to protect survivors of sex trafficking. And for those of you who were not here, we'll have a recording available and can share with you. Now we turn our conversation to this evening with Berkeley Journalism Dean Geeta Anand and journalist Michelle Goldberg about democracy and authoritarianism in the context of gender, race, identity in the United States. And while progress is often at the heart of the story of the U.S. that the U.S. likes to tell itself, the backlash to that progress is just as central, if not more so. Now on to a brief introduction of our speakers, who I believe you all know well. Michelle Goldberg is a Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism alum, class of 1998. She became an opinion columnist for the New York Times in 2017 and was part of a team that won a Pulitzer Prize in 2018 for public service for reporting on workplace sexual harassment issues. She is the author of 3 books, and as well, her first book, which was Kingdom Coming, The Rise of Christian Nationalism, won the Helen Bernstein Award for Excellence in Journalism. Finalist.
Yeah.
Apologies.
That's okay.
Should have won. She also is a former grantee of the Pulitzer Center. Dean Anand is a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist and author who serves as the dean here at journalism. She worked as a journalist for 27 years and most recently as a foreign correspondent for the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal in India. I learned this in reading your bio. I did not know in terms that the nonfiction book you wrote, The Cure, was about a father's fight to save his children by starting a biotechnology to create medicine for their untreatable illness, was then made into a movie that starred Harrison Ford called Extraordinary Measures. So thank you for that, as well as all the work that you do. And now I'll hand it over to you. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Anne and the Pulitzer Center, and thank you all for being here. And why would anyone not be here today? Oh my God, I am so excited for all of us to be in conversation with you.
Oh, thank you.
As I was thinking about what makes you so unique, beyond just the quality of your reporting, which is phenomenal, sort of the freshness of your thinking and your nuanced view of politics and the Middle East and feminism and conservatism. It's also, to my mind, that you manage to write courageously about things other people are afraid to talk about, but also with compassion, so that we can understand the humanity of the other side or the other person or the offending party. And I want to talk to you today about journalism and how you do that, about gender, about the backlash that you've been talking and writing a lot about authoritarianism and the link to anti-feminism, and then also about the Middle East. And then there's so many things to talk to Michelle about. It's a little overwhelming, but also I want to be sure that we have a chance to talk about the election and what this week's results mean for Biden.
Mm-hmm.
So first the journal, and then what we'll do is we'll be in conversation for about an hour, and then we're going to open it up for a good 40 minutes of Q&A. So start thinking about what you'd like to ask Michelle. But first, a journalism question. But I think this journalism question touches on the challenge of dialoguing about difficult, painful issues, which we as a campus have been struggling with, and which I'll definitely ask you about later, about free speech on campus in the context of this Middle East war. But how do you do it? Has it come natural? Is it intentional, or is this something that came to you naturally? Or did you have to develop that muscle of making sure to see the other side or the other point of view in a column humanely?
Well, I think I had to develop that muscle just as I got older. I think that when I was a young person, when I was at the Berkeley Journalism School, I was probably fairly shrill in my beliefs. And to me, some of that actually, I think, comes from, some of it just comes from being old, seeing, views that you held like extremely firmly be disproved, right? Or seeing that the way kind of the world develops in ways that you weren't expecting. But some of it actually, I think, comes from becoming like more secure in your views. And so this is something I often talk about in the context of abortion. I've always been very pro-choice. It's what sort of got me into being interested in politics in the first place. I grew up in Buffalo, New York, and my first sort of formative political experience was in high school when Operation Rescue came to shut down the clinics in town after they had first gone to Wichita, Kansas, and they had very successfully shut down all the clinics there, and then they came to Buffalo, and the pro-choice side organized, and I would go, before homeroom, everybody would link arms and like physically keep the clinic open, and it was like extremely satisfying, actually, because you don't usually like get to declare victory at the end of your first day of activism, but for a long time I couldn't, I don't think, speak civilly to anti-abortion activists. I was so angry at them, and then, again, you get older and you mellow, but also I think something that changed for me was having kids. And as I went through pregnancy, I became like much more pro-choice and much more, but also much more like aware of kind of the different stages of fetal development. And, so sort of and also aware of the kind of value of the fetus and some of the more kind of ethically difficult questions that come up in later pregnancy. And so I felt like the more I knew about it, the less sort of threatened and defensive I got by speaking to people who kind of challenged my assumptions and beliefs. And I like to think that applies to other subjects, but I do think that, and there's still things that obviously are hard to talk about, but I think that, sometimes like a certain amount of kind of intense defensive-ness can be a result from having strong beliefs and not feeling like you can confidently articulate kind of what underlies them.
I'm going to come back to this when we talk about the Middle East, but I want to be sure, since our primary topic is gender and authoritarianism, that we start there. So, like many of you, I read Susan Faloudi's book, The Backlash, and I was thinking about the backlash, about something that happened at that moment in time. I just hadn't thought about it as a continuum. Can you tell us how you think about it and where we are today?
So that book has helped me so much, and just talking to Susan Faludi has helped me so much in sort of understanding where we are today. I mean, and I think on two different levels. There's, on the one hand, there's the obvious backlash. Dobbs was, Roe versus Wade was overturned. Abortion was banned in many different states. There's this ferocious right-wing backlash from Donald Trump on down. Some of you might have seen, I feel this is like a small story, but maybe an emblematic one. I don't know if any of you remember this story from September, where this woman made like a TikTok video about how, because she doesn't have kids, she was able to spend Sunday or a weekend day like binge watching TV and learning how to make shakshuka. And it became like the backlash, like it went viral, and the reaction was like so ferocious that there were like multiple news stories about the amount of just absolute fury that she had received, and Trump officials say, talking about how this woman had this empty life, and just, and so again, it's like a small story, but an emblematic one. And, I think that when Susan Faludi wrote her book, there was much more of a kind of monolithic mainstream media, right? So there was a kind of backlash that I don't think you would see today, right? Like, I don't think you're going to see a Time magazine cover. Well, first of all, Time magazine covers don't have the same kind of agenda-setting quality. You're also not going to have a Time magazine cover saying, why are single childless women so unhappy? And right, and you're not going to have, you're not going to have like a lot of think pieces about, women kind of letting their biological clock run out, or, kind of losing their chance to having there was a big thing in the 80s, right, about women having a bigger chance, a greater chance of being killed by terrorists than getting married after a certain age. So you're not going to, so things are fragmented in a way, and there's more progressive and feminist representation in mainstream publications. You're not going to see that, but what you do see is in like certain parts of the media, a ferocity and kind of ugliness that, the backlash, I think, that Susan Faludi wrote about really framed itself as kind of benevolent. It framed itself as, we're just concerned that all these women are making decisions that are making them so unhappy. And now it's much more punitive. I mean, there's still plenty of that, but there's also just like, single childless women who vote Democratic are going to be the downfall of civilization. You have kind of people who are either, kind of mainstream people or adjacent to the mainstream, literally talking about repealing the 19th Amendment, and I don't think they're actually going to repeal the 19th Amendment, but the fact that you can kind of say that and still be and still be an influential political voice is like, that's a change. And so, and at the same time, you have, obviously most people don't want to live in the world that the backlash would create for us. And so I think what you have is this kind of like ratchet where, we've seen, and this, I know forgive me if I'm jumping ahead, but like, we've seen in these recent elections, last night was just the most recent example that when people can actually vote on these issues, there's overwhelming there's overwhelming support, like in the small d democratic sense, for reproductive rights, most certainly. And also just, there's like a rejection of the kind of broader culture warring attempts to reinstate quote unquote traditional values. You've seen like something else that happened kind of more below the radar yesterday was a bunch of right-wing school board candidates were defeated, including in places like Loudoun, Virginia, which has been just like an absolute epicenter of the culture war over, gender ideology and quote unquote critical race theory. So what I think you see on the right is an ever greater recognition of the fact that like their project, that democracy is inimical to their project. And so the kind of broader anti-democratic movement in our politics, which we can talk about, is I think now intimately intertwined with like the anti-feminist and anti-abortion movement.
Is the backlash we're experiencing now more severe and more virulent than the backlashes we've seen over time? Like, walk us through sort of the Bush years and Obama and Trump and put it all into a historical context.
Well, so I can do recent history,
Yeah.
but like, I think that, I think it's more, I mean, it's more virulent for sure. You know, it might be more concentrated. As I said, I think it has less sort of, you know, establishment backing, right? You kind of, it doesn't, you know, it doesn't pervade the network news. It doesn't pervade, you know, kind of what now exists as the mainstream media. But in some ways, there is no mainstream anymore. So that, you know, there's just a lot of different kind of fragmentary.
So do you think that's because it's more on the fringe, or?
Well, I think that I mean, I think it's increasingly hard to say what the fringe is, right? I mean, in some way, like, is the former president of the United States the fringe? Like, I don't know. Like, right? I mean, that's sort of like the story of our time, right? Is this collapse of anything that can be seen as, I don't mean like the center in terms of centrism, but just a sort of collapse of like a common culture. And so, you know, it seems like the fringe to me, it probably seems like the fringe to most of the people in this room, but it also, you know, for fringe, it has an enormous amount of power. And, you know, an enormous amount of reach.
Let's talk about conservative thought and how the backlash has influences and pervades conservative thought today.
Okay, so Susan Faludi, I mean, I think it's always been there in terms of, and you know, this is something I say all the time, and it's not just in America, right? That like gender equality is sort of inextricable from urbanism, secularism, modernity, sort of everything that authoritarians want to undo. And so, you know, there is sort of no returning to a lost golden age, quote unquote golden age, without restoring some sort of, not even always traditional gender hierarchy, but a kind of modern projection of what would be a traditional gender hierarchy, but some sort of like reinscription of what people believe to be like the quote unquote natural order of things. So every authoritarian movement is sort of anti-feminist. You can't, even the ones, say, you know, in France or something, France, on the one hand, they will sometimes say that they want to protect French secularism from the forces of Islamism. But at the same time, you know, they also want women to have more babies and, you know, bring the birth rates up and kind of, you know, increase the social cachet and power of Catholicism. So in this country, I think that, again, I think it's the difference between what's changed. I mean, what's stayed the same is that this idea that the breakdown in this idea that kind of a breakdown in like relations between the sexes is a harbinger of social decay and social decline, right? So you see that in, you know, Susan Faludi wrote about that in some of the books that she wrote about. There was, you know, a huge amount of concern that like feminism was going to lead to social implosion. I think that, you know, and there was, you know, obviously a huge amount of anti-abortion activism that has pervaded the Republican Party since Ronald Reagan and has slowly kind of driven out the remaining, you know, there was a time not that long ago when there was significant numbers of pro-choice Republicans. Now they're a very endangered species. Again, I think what's changed is that they used to have, the right used to have this sense that that it's, I mean, that it spoke for the quote unquote moral majority, right? That's why, and I think a lot of them have lost that sense. And as they've lost that sense, they've turned on, you know, democracy, as I said before. They've also increasingly, there's a kind of intense pessimism about America more broadly. And so instead of this, you know, sunny vision of Ronald Reagan, which could be very dark at times, but was kind of fundamentally optimistic in its own way. You have this like intensely dark, apocalyptic feeling of like a kind of final battle in which, because the right is so embattled, no matter how much power they amass, that all sorts of tactics, up to and including January 6th are legitimatized.
Let's talk about this week's elections. What did you make of the election, just in terms of what it says about how much abortion will be an issue in the national election?
So I think we've seen this over and over again. This was just kind of like the latest, it was very exciting, but it was also like the latest data point in a whole there's been a whole bunch of referenda since Dobbs was decided. And the pro-choice side has won all of them. There's also been a whole bunch of special elections where Democrats have consistently overperformed. And so, I was, in some ways, I was more interested in, I had assumed issue 1 in Ohio would pass. It passed by, I had assumed it would pass because there was already a kind of pre-referenda on issue 1. Conservatives in Ohio had thought that issue 1 would pass, and so they had an earlier referenda where they tried to change the rules about referenda in order to thwart it. And that was, kind of widely seen for what it was, as a proxy vote about abortion, and the pro-choice side won there. So it seemed likely that it was going to win again. It was still like very exciting. It was exciting that, the margin by which they won, especially Ohio. Ohio's a very Republican state. The thing that can be tricky, I think, is extrapolating these results into the kind of into partisan politics, is that one thing that referenda allows is that it disaggregates like partisanship from just people's feelings about abortion. So there's a lot of people who hate Democrats or negatively polarized against Democrats. I shouldn't say a lot of people, but a significant number of people, who don't like the religious right, are kind of libertarian on these issues, but, again, they would not consider in many cases voting for Democrats. So it's why you consistently see, and this isn't just true of abortion, when you see referenda, for example, on minimum wage, you constantly will get much higher results, much greater numbers of people voting to increase the minimum wage than will vote for a Democrat running on the platform of increasing the minimum wage. And the same is true with abortion rights. It's also true, with a number of other things. But what was interesting was not just that issue 1 passed, but that Democrats were very explicitly running on abortion rights in Virginia against, Glenn Youngkin, who has positioned himself as kind of the Democrat, who's positioned himself as the Republican who knows how to escape the post-Dobbs Republican curse. Not so much. So you had, Democrats deny him a trifecta and win the legislature. And then you saw Andy Beshear win in Kentucky against and again, Kentucky, he's very popular. He's the most popular governor in the country. But still, the fact that like a Democrat can win in Kentucky, running very explicitly again on abortion rights against the Donald Trump endorsed Republican running against them is, it's reason for optimism. How much that translates to a national election is a little bit hard to say, because something that's happened as the parties have polarized by education, you see, and also as kind of a lot of like suburban women have turned against the Republican Party, people who used to be sort of the base of the Republican Party, or not the base, but a power center for the Republican Party, that these are like people who are often like highly conscientious and vote in primary elections. And so the Democrats now have an advantage in kind of low turnout elections, which didn't necessarily used to be the case. Presidential elections kind of bring out everybody, and so I think it's an open question whether this advantage still accrues in a presidential context.
So let's talk about Biden and Trump in the context. So I know it's an open question, but what does this week's election tell us, or what hints does it give us for what this means for the presidential election?
Well, I think that one thing that was really heartening was that youth turnout was not down. There's a lot of concern, again, because Biden is unpopular. He's, widely perceived as being too old. And, I have tended to believe, I'm like very, very scared about this election, but I've also tended to believe that some of the undecided people are going to break towards Biden, or like the people who kind of dislike both of them, or the people who, maybe voted for Trump and then voted for Biden. Right now, like Trump's numbers tend to go down when he's in the spotlight. Like some of his lowest numbers were when he was doing those COVID press conferences. And so, and in some ways, his sort of deplatforming from Twitter, and also just the collapse of Twitter as something that drives the news cycle, has been a double-edged sword. I mean, I understand why they deplatformed him and supported it at a time when he was, using it to incite violent insurrection. But the fact that I think people have sort of forgotten about how crazy he was. They sort of forgotten about he's out. He's running on he's running on, kind of redeem the martyrs of January 6th. But I'm not sure how much people are actually hearing that or watching his rallies. His rallies certainly aren't being televised the way they used to, and there's a lot of good reason for that. But so I tend to think things will shift as he goes back, as he regains the spotlight. Although who knows? But the young voters thing is something that I've been very concerned about. I think they're very concerned about, especially given the intense disaffection over his policies in Israel and Palestine. And I'm very worried. I'm writing now about there's going to be, I think, some very divisive primary campaigns against several members of the squad. That should they knock these representatives out, I think it'll be devastating on a number of levels, right? When you're losing young voters and people of color to have the Democratic Party to have the Democratic Party kind of get rid of some of its most effective surrogates seems devastating, but also just the coalition that elected Obama and elected Biden, I worry about it fragmenting in these primary battles, and yet, my friend Chris tweeted this, that, the experience of Democrats in the last 3 years has been constant panic over bad polling, punctuated by consistently better than expected elections. And so if that pattern holds, then obviously that's good news for Joe Biden.
So let's talk about the people you're worried will get knocked out of the race, and what is it that would knock them out of the race? Are you talking about sort of the polarized discussion right now on the Middle East?
Yes. Yeah. So so there's always been opposition among kind of one-sidedly pro-Israel groups, AIPAC and a related group called the Democratic Majority for Israel, they were against, for example, so I'm focusing on, my reporting right now, I'm doing a piece about Jamal Bowman, who is a representative from upstate New York, or not upstate New York, actually. His district kind of encompasses, two very different parts of the Democratic coalition, because it stretches from the northern part of the Bronx into these kind of ritzy suburbs in Westchester. And so, it's a majority minority district, but also a district with a lot of Jewish people who are kind of part of the traditional organized Jewish community, who are extremely unhappy with a lot of the stances that he's very pro-Palestinian, like most of the members of the squad. And can speak about it. He's been to the West Bank, he's been to places like Hebron, where you see the occupation at its ugliest, and has this unwillingness, I think, to bend to what he sees as sort of political correctness around Israel and Palestine. And he was, even in 2020, he ran a primary against this guy named Elliot Engel, who had been, a very long time friend of Israel, chair of the Foreign Relations Committee, and so someone who was very entrenched. It was kind of a shock primary, or it was a shock upset, and the Democratic Majority for Israel had run ads against him in 2020. They didn't really come out against him in 2022, in part because he had two primary opponents, and so there was just like a kind of coordination problem. And he won a majority in that primary. He's popular in the district, but there's people in the district, and I've met them, who supported him in those two elections, who are now extremely upset with his voting record and his, he was one of a handful of members of Congress who boycotted Israeli President Isaac Herzog when he came and spoke to Congress. And he is doing, I think, he's sort of modeling, I think, what the way public officials should be behaving in such a polarized time. Like, he held this meeting that I went to on Monday. It was called a healing breakfast, and he had invited like Jewish people in his community to come and basically yell at him for like over an hour. A lot of rabbis boycotted it, but a lot of members of the Jewish community came. There was people who showed up to protest him, who then ended up just coming to the meeting and talking, telling him how much pain they were in, how unrepresented they felt. I don't think he changed anyone's mind but he did, you could kind of feel the temperature in the room like go down. If initially I thought it was going to be extremely explosive and there was people yelling at him in the parking lot. And by the end, people were kind of like, he made a few cracks, people were laughing. There was, again, people felt maybe angry, but still heard. And so his race, to me, is kind of a microcosm, because there's going to be primaries against, there's going to be primaries against Cori Bush, there's going to be primaries against Ilhan Omar, there's going to be primary against Rashida Tlaib, and there's going to be a huge amount of money poured into these primaries. The demographics of there's going to be a primary against Summer Lee. These are all different members of the squad, and so it's in the past, AIPAC and the Democratic Majority for Israel have targeted, one of the first people that they took out was Andy Levin in Michigan, who is, kind of a progressive Jew. But right now, everyone that they're targeting is a person of color. And so it's going to, again, these fissures that in the Democratic Party are going to be kind of ripped wide open. And I think a lot of people have to do a lot of thought about how to maintain a coalition under that kind of pressure.
How do you maintain a coalition under that kind of pressure? Like, is the meeting you went to part of the solution?
Yes, I think it's part of the solution, although I'm not sure, there was also part of it that, like, one woman was saying to me, and I think this is, a problem for him, is that she's like, I love him personally. And this will be in the piece that comes out in next week, but she, I love him personally. He's so warm, he's so open, he's amazing. There's no bridge between where we are on these issues. And like, I just can't support him anymore. And that's a really hard thing. That's not the kind of thing that outreach can necessarily overcome. I think the only thing that can really overcome that is some sort of lessening of tensions in Israel and Palestine that make both the war itself and the kind of explosion of anti-Semitism that we've seen, the explosion of kind of institutional repression against pro-Palestinian voices, like that will just kind of reduce the intense like salience of this issue.
So I want to talk to you about that, the challenge of that bridge. But before that, I want to talk to you about just journalism and the difference between being a reporter and being a columnist. Like you very much, as just you're describing your process just now, going to this meeting, interviewing all these people there, you very much report your columns. Tell us about your process.
Sure. I mean, I don't know that I really have a process. I mean, because that, like, you know, so I have my colleague Russ Dowsett, someone who is, you know, he's one of my conservative colleagues, but he's someone I think is really good at his job. And he is someone who can just sit in his office and kind of synthesize what he's reading and pull ideas out of his head. And I can do that to an extent, but I often, like, if I don't feel like I'm like out in the world reporting things, finding things out, I feel like I kind of run out of ideas fairly quickly. And so, you know, and the kind of great privilege of this job from my point of view is that you get to go out into the world and parachute into all different sorts of milieus. And so in terms, I mean, so I still, you know, I've always been, like when I was here, I wanted to become a magazine journalist. That was my dream. It was to basically write for the New Yorker. And so I still, you know, so I never wanted to just be like a straight news reporter, even though, you know, I'm really thankful that while I was here, I kind of learned how to do that, you know, under some duress, but in retrospect, in a way that was like super valuable for me. But I've always kind of had a point of view. And so in some ways, writing a column is just like really condensing that process, you know, because instead of like marinating in a story over many weeks, you're kind of churning them out, you know, and sometimes I just have an opinion or I'm angry about something someone did and I don't need to go out and talk to a lot of people. But, you know, sort of what I try to do at least, and what I try to do in the pieces that I am most proud of is to kind of use the reporting process to figure out where I'm really attracted to stories where I'm like, I don't know what I think about this. And I can use the reporting process and the writing process to try to figure out what I don't know who said I write to figure out what I think, but that's, you know, and so, and hopefully people can, you know, sort of follow along on as they see you kind of working your way through something.
So I want you to take us along for a journey where the reporting changed how you thought about something.
Okay, so a recent one, I guess, was, so I don't know if it necessarily changed my mind as much as it changed, so reporting on RFK Jr., you know, who is like, he's not a person I'm sympathetic to and it's not a movement I'm sympathetic to. But going to his rally and kind of listening to his supporters and talking to a lot of his supporters, again, I didn't become, you know, I still think he's a sinister demagogue, but I became, I think, sympathetic to the degree to which he is putting together this coalition of the distrustful and the degree to which the people that I spoke to have been left feeling sort of like both like politically and also just psychologically adrift. But so I'm going to go back to another story in a second, but because there's another story about people being like kind of, I think, set adrift by COVID, you know, and a lot of people, they just kept saying, you know, I don't know who to believe anymore. You know, first they tell you don't wear masks, then they said wear masks, then they said cloth masks, then they say cloth masks don't work, and then, you know, they made us get the vaccine, they said it was going to stop transmission, and then they say, you know, no, we never said it was going to stop transmission. And in a way, like, if you followed these debates, you sort of know that that's kind of how scientific findings evolve, right? Like this was something new and people were discovering things as they go. But I think if you are like fundamentally don't trust authority or have a fundamentally like skeptical attitude towards authority, you're like, why are there all these contradictions? And why were they so sure? And then they're so sure about the other thing. And they never explained themselves. They never said sorry, you know, and I do think that there was a way in which the sort of militant certainty of, certainly on the internet, and part of the problem here is that people were on the internet way too much, and so there was a kind of militant certainty that they encountered, a kind of intense scolding and like contempt for, their, either their like fears or their economic dislocation during lockdown, the kind of like singular horror, which I experienced, that is remote schooling. And they feel like they were being just like sort of given orders and being stigmatized for asking questions. And so, again, the piece, I think, did not come out ultimately. Although it's funny, there was someone that I spoke to, one of his, this kind of podcast bro, who's a big supporter of his, who it's a weird 6 degree of separation. It's weird that we have a mutual friend, but we do have a mutual friend who put me in touch with him. So he spoke to me, even though he was very hesitant. And I was like, well, he's going to hate this piece. And he didn't. He was actually like, you reflected what I think. You captured what I believe, even, and so, you didn't misquote me or whatever. So that's a piece where I came out, again, feeling not necessarily changed, but like, I guess my orientation towards these people changed. Something I would say even more than that was when I went to go cover the Ottawa trucker protests. Do you remember there was these like trucks that shut down? And when I've written a lot about the far right, I went there expecting to find like a lot of neo-Nazis, a lot of, kind of militia types. And I found some of them for sure, and that's clearly who organized it. But a lot of these people were, again, people who had just been unmoored by COVID and maybe didn't really have any politics at all, but were being radicalized by this movement that had embraced them and sort of told them what they wanted to hear at a time when they felt like they were, there was no, like they were being condemned for their questions or disagreements. I mean, and this is something, like the one book that I kind of am always urging people to read about kind of our current terrible situation is Naomi Klein's great book, Doppelganger. And I think that that's something that she captured when she writes about people who had been, when she writes about knocking on doors of people who had been reliable left-wing voters and finding that they had been radicalized to the right in the course of the pandemic.
One more journalism question. So tell us about like the best and the worst part about being at the New York Times.
Okay. I mean, the best part, well, there's a couple of best parts. I mean, obviously the reach you have is incomparable. And the, kind of support structures that you have.
How do you feel the reach? How do you experience it? Or how do you?
Well, I think, it's funny, because it doesn't, I feel like the first few times I wrote for the Times, I would get all these emails from people. Like now, nobody's really, but you hear from people, and people, you both hear from people and people will often talk to you because, whatever, like there's a lot of people who kind of have to care what the New York Times says about them. So it's like easy to get senators to talk to you, for example. It's easy to get answers from politicians. It's easy to get a lot of people on the phone. And we get to, I sit in a lot of editorial board meetings when interesting people come in. So you get to meet a lot of, kind of fascinating people that I don't encounter in, my ordinary life.
Or like a couple of recent ones.
Well, not even recent, but one I would say is the King of Jordan, which that wasn't that recent, but I've obviously been thinking a lot about that meeting, and it was like I think maybe last year or the year before that, and then and then this actually was very recent. And I shouldn't say it's like it was gut wrenching, but it was to me an honor. Was meeting with a lot of the families of hostage victims, or the families of hostages in Gaza. But also, foreign heads of state, like all kinds of people come through the Times, and you can, getting to sit in on those meetings is, for me, something that is still like such a profound privilege. I think the worst part of being at the Times is that everybody reads it. Not everybody reads it, but you kind of have, especially when I'm writing twice a week, there can be, thank God we have editors now. Columnists haven't always had editors, but, so you feel like you have, or at least I feel like I have a safety net, but, you still know that, if you make a mistake, it's going to be, some cases national news, and so, so it's a lot of pressure.
Okay, Michelle, my next week's class is, I teach one of the intro classes, is on fact checking. Mm-hmm. So tell us about an error you made.
Oh, God.
Like the worst error you can think of. And and how an editor, how fact checking might have caught it, or more rigorous fact checking. Or is it an error of point of view, or what would you say?
Okay, the worst mistake I've ever made, and it's I can't even laugh about it. I still feel very awful about it. And this was shortly before I got this job. So it kind of coincided with my job being announced. And so there was many stories about it in many publications. I was reviewing a book about rape on campus. And the book said, I'm hoping I could get all, now I'm counting facts from a terrible thing that happened 6 years ago. The book basically said that that there was a much, I can't remember the exact thing, and so, but it was something, the dispute was about whether students on college campuses were more likely to be victims of rape than students who have, than women who haven't gone to college. And I basically, I basically said, I'd cited a fact. I said, I can't believe that someone could write this whole book and not know this fact. And the author of the book came back and said, no, I did know that claim, I just didn't buy it. And it was sort of a subtle distinction. I still believe that she was wrong, but I imputed ignorance to what was a disagreement, and it was a huge blow up. That the new hire. The new hire at the New York Times has already made this, huge mistake, and it was really awful. It was this shadow cast over this new job. And I also felt bad for, again, I think that I fundamentally think that the interpretation of the data in this book was wrong. But that statement about the difference between being wrong and kind of knowing the background and just not interpreting it the same way that you did, the same way that I did. And it was a hard thing because the fact checker obviously went through the quotes in the book and went through, the stuff that I linked to say that it wasn't right. And so in some ways, the fact checker, it's not the fact checker's fault, right? It's my fault.
Or an editor saying, maybe we should say no, because how do you know what the person knows?
Right, exactly.
Rather than,
yes. So I suppose that could have helped me.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so speaking of campuses, let's talk about free speech on campuses. And we're just struggling in academia to talk in any constructive way about the Middle East war. And I know you have just a lot of thoughts about, why we're struggling and how we might do it better. And just.
So, I feel like this is kind of, and I've written about this somewhat, but maybe not as consistently as maybe I should have. I have, over the past 6 years and before then, I have written a number of pieces about, kind of the left-wing illiberalism and the kind of ultimately, I think, suicidal departure from defenses of free speech, I haven't harped on it as much as maybe I should have, because I've believed, and I actually still believe, that the real threats to free speech in this country come from the right, which is, not just canceling ideas that they don't like, but criminalizing them or banning them, kind of using the legislative process to suppress ideas, and kind of, that's censorship. We can have a debate, I think, about whether, kind of boycotting or stigmatizing or bullying constitutes censorship. I think some of that stuff is a little bit more indeterminate. But, I have written about, kind of no platforming and this like censorious mood that has taken hold on parts of the left. And something I've written about, I think, over and over again that has in fact been the case is that it would ultimately blow up in the left's face. And I think you see that now on college campuses, both because, so I've argued over and over again that, anti-Zionism is not the same thing as anti-Semitism. There's a popular definition of anti-Semitism called the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's definition. This is getting a little deep in the weeds, but that groups a lot of forms of anti-Zionism under the rubric of anti-Semitism, and is getting, increasingly, there's efforts to give legal force to it, so you could bring a civil rights complaint for being kind of in a deeply anti-Zionist environment. And I think that that's really dangerous. But at the same time, when Jewish students are saying, we have been kind of inculcated with the importance of extreme sensitivity to identity-based slights, and we've been inculcated with the idea that kind of, oppressed people get to decide what sort of language is oppressive or offensive. And you kind of can't, or just like the whole kind of idea of like microaggressions, you can't say that applies to everybody except Jewish students. I mean, to me, that is sort of anti-Semitic. And so people are in a bind because Jewish students expect these standards, or not all Jewish students, obviously. There's plenty of anti-Zionist or a-Zionist Jewish students, or certainly plenty of Jewish students who've been involved in organizing these protests against Israel's bombing of Gaza. But there's also a lot who are kind of demanding a level of sensitivity that they feel like has been regularly afforded to other groups, and demanding that sensitivity then conflicts with the free speech rights of many advocates for Palestinian rights. And so you have this situation where the Jewish students, again, to generalize, where some Jewish students feel bullied and ignored and made unsafe, and feel like when they say that they feel unsafe, it's dismissed. And at the same time, there's been genuine anti-Semitism, like however you define anti-Semitism. There's certain acts that are obviously anti-Semitic, swastikas painted on walls, and Jewish students being assaulted and things like that. And then at the same time, there is this institutional crackdown on a lot of pro-Palestinian expressions, so that you have, both kind of law firms saying that they're not going to hire students from schools that they deem anti-Semitic, and also, Brandeis just recently de-recognized their Students for Justice in Palestine chapter, and the Anti-Defamation League has called on, I think, 200 other universities to investigate their own SBJ chapters for quote-unquote material support of terrorism. In Florida, they've banned Students for Justice in Palestine on, also citing kind of terrorism statutes. And this goes in a real, when you start kind of talking about having views, even, and some of the stuff they point to Students for Justice in Palestine's online toolkit, which says a lot of stuff that I think is pretty abhorrent. But when you start kind of conflating speech with terrorism, you're in this like super, super dangerous situation. And I mean, whatever, this was never going to not be an explosive situation, but so much of this could have been avoided, or not avoided, but like could have been made better if there had been a more solid commitment to free speech in the first place. so that it didn't seem now like it was a double standard when you say that, no, you have to endorse speech that makes you uncomfortable, which I actually think you do. But, and so I think everyone's getting an education in the necessity of a robust definition of free speech that we should have, I think, never forsworn in the first place.
We've been struggling so much here at Berkeley. The law schools had a really hard time. There's complaints of anti-Semitism in classrooms and not specifically at the journalism school, but across campus. What would your response be as a journalist? And we were the journalism school here on campus.
To me, the response as a journalist, I mean, especially if you're like a journalism student, is that this is an amazing opportunity, right? Because what's happening on campuses is suddenly at the center of political discussion in a way it hasn't been for a long time. I mean, I think there was hearings today in the House on campus anti-Semitism. There's been congressional resolutions on campus anti-Semitism. Like I was talking about Jamal Bowman, a central complaint against him, which I don't really think has merit, but it's a central complaint, is that he's not doing enough to protect students from campus anti-Semitism. So suddenly, what's going on here at Berkeley is like at the center of national debate. That's like an amazing thing. You can go report on that. But I think that you have, in order to report on that, you have to, again, have a certain kind of commitment to hearing out people that you really disagree with. And, especially on an issue like this where I really believe that both the stories that pro-Palestinian students and pro-Israel students tell about feeling victimized and marginalized are both true. Thank you.
Let's talk about just covering the Middle East. So who's doing it well and how?
Well, I think we're doing, so I have to say that, I have not in the past, agreed with a lot of things that my colleague Tom Friedman writes. I agree with some things he writes, but there's plenty of places where we disagree. But I feel like he has been such an extraordinary voice on this, and not just an extraordinary voice who has built up over the years the credibility to be heard by people who would he has this insight, he has these connections to all the leadership in Israel, and when he talks about when he's critical of the Netanyahu government, he has credibility to make those criticisms with people who were not going to listen to those criticisms coming from a lot of people to his left. So I think he's been extraordinary. Obviously there's been extraordinary reporting by journalists in Gaza who have been, put at enormous risk. And I don't know how many have been killed at this point, but it's like the deadliest conflict for journalists in the world by far. And you've seen, Gazan journalists be killed. You've seen Gazan journalists continue to report after their families have been killed. And, Haaretz, obviously, is to me essential, the kind of left-leaning Israeli newspaper. 972, I don't know if you know about that, but that's a publication that it's a joint Israeli Palestinian publication, and they've also lost one of their contributors in Gaza. I'm sure that there are more, but those are the ones that kind of come immediately to mind.
I'm going to open it up for questions just in a couple of minutes. So be thinking of your questions while I ask Michelle one last question, just again about journalism in the Middle East and your own journalism. So you talked about Thomas Friedman and just the impact and the relationships he's built and the meaningful journalism. And just wondering, do you see any journalists? Of course, impact is measured years ahead.
Actually, I think the best single piece I've read about what's happening is David Remnick's big piece from. But yeah.
Yeah, talk about what made it so powerful and why you think that.
Well, I mean, it was so, I think that, I mean, he just kind of, because of his stature, there's people who need to look for the angle, and then there's people who can just kind of go straight at something and say, this is what's happened, this is what's happening. And it was a series of scenes that both, I think it's been a struggle for a lot of people to kind of hold two things in their heads at the same time, right? Both the brutality of the occupation and the brutality of this government. I think it's tempting sometimes for people who especially have grown up as like American Zionists to imagine that their values are shared by the Israeli government when they're not necessarily, this government, this isn't, these people are not Yitzhak Rabin. But to keep that, and to hold in mind both the kind of unbelievable brutality of what Hamas did and the unbelievable brutality of what's happening to Palestinians in response, and the just intense complexity of how any government would respond to something like this on its doorstep. Even, I don't know, I just felt like there's one scene I just keep thinking about, this funeral that he went to for an entire family that had been killed in one of the kibbutzim, and just like the howls of grief, while at the same time, and being able to capture that and like fully convey that, while at the same time also trying to convey, he wasn't able to go into Gaza. No outside journalists have been able to go into Gaza except from like very brief forays with the army. But, but talking to people in Gaza and being simultaneously able to say, this family, but also this family. It was just like, it was both so comprehensive and so humane. And that's, that's just like the piece that I kind of wish everybody screaming at each other on both sides would read.
So the final question before we open up for questions is about despair. You've said at times, you've talked about despair, and does this time make you despair? And what's the antidote to despair?
Well, so for me, because like when I felt intense despair, which I do, I tend to try to, so sometimes I've made that my subject. I've tried to write about other people's despair, how feelings of despair tend to impact our politics. To me, that's kind of how I metabolize things, is to go out and report on them, and report on how they're affecting other people, or to write about them. So I think people have different anecdotes, right? Like one anecdote to despair, obviously, is activism for a lot of people. And something I think about a lot is, and to bring this back to gender, I was in a really dark place after Donald Trump was elected, like really dark. And I remember the first time I felt sort of okay was in April of that year when I went to Georgia, because there was a special election in Georgia for Tom Price. Tom Price had been the Republican congressman in the 6th district and was Donald, I can't remember, what was it like, anyway, he joined Trump's cabinet. He wasn't there for very long, but he joined Trump's cabinet. The seat opened up. Nobody thought that the seat could go Democratic because it had been Newt Gingrich's old seat, and then it was Tom Price's. And there was this campaign to elect this young guy named John Ossoff. So I went there to cover the campaign, and what I saw was, I met like so many women who had been basically apolitical before the 2016 election and woke up on the day after it and were so shocked and so furious, and all of a sudden had like thrown themselves into local politics. And they, their husbands like didn't recognize them. They all they had all this local knowledge because they'd been like PTA moms, and all this local knowledge they suddenly put into creating like walk lists. So outsiders will come and canvass an area, but they would be like, well, this house, the husbands are Republican, but I think the wife would talk to us, so we have to go there while he's still at work, but she has gotten home. They just had this kind of local knowledge that you cannot buy, and they were so relentless, and just seeing them and seeing that energy, it was amazing. It was like witnessing this kind of consciousness raising, on this mass scale. And they didn't win that special election. John Ossoff didn't win, but then they won the next election and they elected Lucy McBath. And then, of course, John Ossoff became a senator. And you've since seen some of that same energy, both flip the House, but also, to go back to what we were talking about before with like issue 1 and so, I feel like it's much easier to despair. It's much easier to despair when, or at least for me, when I'm like at my computer looking at social media and like being out in the world with people who are doing real things. I don't know if it's the antidote, but it's an antidote.
Thank you so much. Wow. And I want to open it up to questions now. If you'll raise your hand, Leah Swindle will race up to you with a mic. Okay.
Okay. Hi, my name is Gisela. I work at the Investigative Reporting Program, and I'm proudly also a J-School alum. Thank you so much. Geeta was my J200 instructor. So I'm born and raised in Mexico City. There's this idea that I've always found very alien in the US, which is First Amendment equals free market, right? If you don't regulate the speech, may the best speech win. So is the lesson really that we should be more quote, quote, tolerant towards speech that makes us uncomfortable? And my question is, couldn't have all of this been de-escalated earlier had we not tolerated those extremes in the first place? And how do you weave in the lessons that we have learned from social media platforms, applying that free market ideology to speech and the backlash that we're seeing today? Thank you.
Okay, so it's a really good question because obviously, the thing about social media is that social media has never been a kind of quote unquote free market, right? Social media algorithms always elevate some sorts of speech over others, and they particularly reward inflammatory speech and those are that's not really a free speech issue. That's like a business and regulation issue. And kind of one anecdote to that has nothing to do with censorship is just kind of breaking up these platforms so that they can't monopolize the market in the same way. So I guess what you're talking about is kind of like the paradox of tolerance, right? This idea that if you tolerate intolerant speech, eventually you're sort of opening the door to your own destruction. And to me, I think part of the problem is that everybody, or I don't want to say everybody, I think most people believe that there are certain types of speech that should be, if not banned, because I tend to believe, that like the ACLU acted heroically when they defended the rights of Nazis to march in Skokie, Illinois. Right? I think that was the right thing to do. At the same time, there is obviously certain sorts of speech that should be shunned and stigmatized, and that the people that you can also use it's also the free market when you say I'm going to boycott this company, or I'm going to boycott this person, or I'm not going to buy Bud Light because they have a trans person advertising themselves. That might be nasty, but that is also the free market, right? To kind of make these consumer decisions. And so I think that we all agree that that should be done in certain cases. And I think that what happened over the last several years is that the number of the things that were considered beyond the pale expanded to encompass more and more things that quote unquote normal people, and kind of how we conceive of what normal people believe is itself political, but like has expanded to things that more and more people either believe or have questions about. So people feel more and more. So how do we put this? Like, nobody wants to tolerate Holocaust denial, for example. But should we treat, say, questions about vaccine mandates the way we treat Holocaust denial, right? So I just think that there was a kind of a collapsing of certain distinctions and maybe like a spirit of, these aren't necessarily legislative matters, they're kind of cultural matters, but a desire, and I think I understand the desire, right? Because all of a sudden during the Trump years, you had, both kind of white supremacy running rampant, you had all sorts of demagoguery running rampant, then COVID comes along, and you have misinformation running rampant, and people want to kind of hold the line, and there's this growing rigidity. But the growing rigidity, I think, itself has a kind of radicalizing effect, where people feel like they can't express themselves, they feel like they're being forced to mouth platitudes that they don't necessarily agree with, and then they overhear somebody saying, well, here you can say whatever you want. Like, here you can say what you're, we're saying what you're really thinking, but you're not, but they won't let you say it. And it ends up being, I think, radicalizing. Whereas if you have more space, I think, to air all that stuff, to like maybe air your questions and air your doubts, I think it can take the sting out of it. I think when you try to suppress speech too much, I just think it gives it sometimes this like sheen or glamour of a forbidden truth, and it makes it more attractive to certain people. And I think that happened to a degree with reactionary ideas during the Trump years.
Thank you. Next question.
Hello.
Hi.
I am trying to decide which of well, I'll tell you what I'm thinking. And so you've been talking about, I did not know that this talk would be focused on gender, which is something that I'm thinking about in my studies. But so when we talk about pro-Palestine versus pro-Israel, it kind of reminds me of the way that the pro-life and pro-choice debate has been
Like polarization.
Yeah, the polarization, but also not just the polarization,
Like the
but even how
bifurcation.
we use those terms. And I think that even just using those labels kind of it perpetuates this idea that these two groups are completely separate. And so when I don't remember if it was the New York Times or another media group that talked about, like, well, pro-choice, there are a lot of commonalities among pro-choice and pro-life people. And so you also mentioned the New Yorker article by Thomas.
Or by David Remnick.
That came up too, David Remnick. I read that one, but what came out before that one was something by a name that I don't quite remember, but it was about the Jewish, if I could just find it, I'm sorry, I know it's taking a while. It's by Masha Gessen.
By Masha Gessen?
Yeah, Gessen. Yeah, the tangled grief of Israel's anti-occupation activists, people who are Jewish. Mm-hmm. And I just wonder what your thinking is on why we don't have more stories about that. It's always like, okay, there's this, what this side thinks, there's what that side thinks. Let's humanize both sides. But even saying that narrative of humanizing both sides is missing, is not deconstructing or pulling apart the very idea of two very separate sides.
Right, and there aren't always two
Because-
sides, right? There's multiple sides,
Well,
and
But there are.
Oh, yeah, so what?
There is a question. I am asking what your thinking is on this. And also, I actually am worried about it's taking a while for me to even say the question, because I have lots of questions. But there's which question do I ask?
Well, let's take it sequentially. Let's let her first answer this question, and then we'll let others ask questions, and we can come back to you to ask another question.
No, I don't mean to ask them all.
Oh,
Sorry,
okay,
Sorry, I'm just
okay.
saying. Well, I just heard a comment.
Yeah.
so I think, I think, yes, this is a limitation of language, right? Like all labels are necessarily reductive, but you also kind of need words that talk about different identifiable things. And there are people who identify as pro-Palestinian activists, and there are people who identify as pro-Israel activists, and there are certainly people, I think, whose worldviews and, sometimes their work, encompasses a hope for national, for kind of liberation of both peoples. But, nevertheless, this is a polarized debate. And I think those camps, those labels are imperfect, but they refer to identifiable things. So when Masha Gessen wrote about the anguish of the anti-occupation activists in Israel, that is, first of all, it's a relatively small part of Israeli society, right? The kind of, the left wing, and it's a part of society that was overrepresented among the people who were killed and taken hostage by Hamas, just because of the because of the kibbutzim that they targeted. But I think even a lot of those people, and I've spoken to people on the Israeli left, and there's certainly people who care a lot about ending the occupation, seeing either the emergence of a Palestinian state, or some of the more radical ones want to see a kind of secular binational state with equal rights for everyone. But I think that all those people would still identify as kind of fundamentally pro-Israel, and that they're all still, fundamentally concerned with the survival of the Jewish state. And again, I think some of those people have been, and I've talked to some of them, it's the reason that they're in such a particular sort of anguish is because, they, on the one hand, they have, I'm thinking particularly of someone I spoke to who's the head of basically the Israeli version of the ACLU, someone who's always been on the left, who's always been for a ceasefire in every war that has been waged on Gaza, and felt like she can't really call for one here because she feels like if there's such a thing as a just war, to her, this is it. Not necessarily not the way it's being fought, but the ultimate cause of destroying Hamas. And so, again, these are people who have, they're people who have very nuanced views, don't fit easily into one camp or the other, but nonetheless, I think you need sort of, you can't talk about discrete groups of people unless you have language to kind of categorize them.
Thank you. The mic is rushing forward.
Hello. So this is a journalism question. So given that we're living in information boom, but at the same time highly polarized and siloed age, what's your hope and what's your concern for the next generation or for the future of journalism?
I mean, my biggest concern for the future of journalism is just economic, right? We're seeing this total hollowing out of local news. I mean, I think that's the kind of most urgent existential problem, and that in itself is such a huge driver of polarization and distrust, because local news, I think, fosters a sense of trust in the media, because you can reality test it, right? Like if someone is reporting on something that's going on in your community, then it's harder for you to say like, well, everything in this newspaper is fake, right? You kind of see that you might disagree with the reporting, but you can connect what is being reported to things in your kind of tangible environment. And I think that fosters a broader culture of trust in the media more generally, or at least in, the kind of media that you're getting on your doorstep, not to mention just sort of accountability for what's happening in your own community and a sense of relevance to what's happening in your own community. And, we've seen that business model has been completely destroyed by the internet, and nobody has figured out how to replace it. And there's all kinds of initiatives to try and reinvigorate local news. But, it's just like it's not on anything approaching the scale that is needed. And, there's a lot of, not a lot, there's some progressive billionaire philanthropists and multimillionaire philanthropists, but they don't really want to invest, they don't want to invest in media, and particularly not kind of nonpartisan local media. And so, but then meanwhile, you have on the right a huge commitment to investing in things like Sinclair Broadcasting and like kind of highly partisan local media that can, fill in the gaps that have been left behind. So there's just this total, on the one hand, there's this void, and there's a total asymmetry in the resources that are being used to fill it.
I want to thank you both for this conversation tonight. It's been really important. You've covered so much important ground in really relevant ways. And given your discussion about backlash, about politicians of color, about free speech in the Middle East war, I wonder what your take is on last night's censure of Rashida Tlaib and in the House of Representatives, and sort of what that means for what's coming next. Thank you.
Yeah, so I think it was terrible, and I think especially, again, I think it's terrible on its face, and it's bad for the future of the Democratic Party for the reasons that I said before. You kind of, you have intense disaffection, and I don't really sympathize with people who say that they're not going to vote for Biden because they're furious about this, but it doesn't matter whether I sympathize with it or not. It's a thing. It exists, right? There's been this huge collapse in support, which needs to be rebuilt. And, some of that has to do with kind of how events actually play out, but you also are going to need surrogates. You're going to need people who can go out and speak to people who are disaffected, and the people who are best positioned to do that are the members of the squad, but they're the people who are being kind of targeted right now, both for censure, but then also in, there's going to be a whole bunch of primary campaigns against all of these politicians. So I'm completely against that resolution. I think it was terrible. When she says, when she says that she says from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, and she means that as a liberatory statement. She means it, not as wiping Israel off the map, but that Palestinians will have freedom in the entire territory in which they live. I completely believe in her good faith when she says that, especially because she has actually, and I only learned this recently, that she has actually come out against calls for evacuating settlers from the West Bank, which I disagree with. I think, it's very hard to do, but it's what they should do, I think. And she says, no, you can't, I have a real problem with uprooting people from where they live. That's kind of what we went through. So she has a very universalist belief system. At the same time, I think that it's, when people are saying this language makes me unsafe, this language makes, that's not how it sounds to me, under the sort of rules of speech that we've been operating under for the last 6 years, you don't kind of get to say, well, that's not how I meant it, right? And so I do think that there should be more care and consistency, but that's very different from thinking that there's like any justification for official censure.
Hello, my name's Sasha. I'm a journalism school student. I was also in Geeta's class. Something that I thought was really interesting that you said was this idea that we're losing kind of a common culture or like a middle ground. It's something I've been thinking about a lot in terms of my own journalism and journalism as a whole. I think a trend that I see is in journalism is this idea of tearing down old myths that we have. And part of me, I'm all for that. I'm for the truth, right? And these myths can be dangerous in the sense that they can allow us to, build structures on things that are untrue that maybe hurt some people or don't. But they're also kind of useful because they help create like a common culture and a common purpose and common cause. And I do see that kind of crumbling in our world and in Berkeley in particular. And I'm just wondering how you see the role of like journalists and media kind of in creating maybe that common culture. Or finding that middle again.
I mean, it's really interesting because I think I agree with you, but I'm not sure that journalists can be the ones to sort of, I agree with you about like both that some of these myths are both, untrue or at least like more complicated than they're presented to be, and yet also useful. And I think about like, one of my kids in particular, they go to New York City public schools and is always coming home and being like, has America ever done anything good? And I find myself in like the weird position of being like, there's lots of great things in American history. Like, but, I feel like you sort of need some foundation in that in order to have you need to have in order to believe that kind of progress is possible instead of just, that it's all just kind of a giant farce. And so you do need that. Whether it's the role of journalists to recreate it, I think is a very different thing. And again, I think that the way that you recreate some of that, and I don't know how you do it, is just you need the sort of economic base for a widely read mainstream media. And, and from that, potentially some sort of common understanding of the world can emerge. But I think that if journalists kind of set out to create some sort of commonly understood, version of reality, I don't know how you can do that without kind of lapsing into propaganda.
Hey, sorry. I'm an economics PhD student, and I guess I sort of have a related question about how like media companies can sort of support themselves in a way that they can reach a greater number of readers. I mean, sort of, you mentioned yourself that you're in a privileged position as a New York Times journalist where you can speak to other people and people listen to you. But I do wonder if you think that, there is some role for the media as a gatekeeper in a way where like, there is sort of a greater, you were saying that you don't think that there should be sort of the same type of regulation where it's like more of a business question whether sort of people are allowed to freely express themselves on social media. But don't you think that that's sort of just then replaced, like people just opt out of consuming like traditional media, where I think a lot of people from my generation simply, don't read the New York Times, right. Actually, yeah.
Yeah, well, so those are two different questions, right? Because there's the kind of like, the question of how you support yourself is different than the question of regulation for social media. So when I say regulation, I don't think that doesn't mean, banning people as opposed to, again, if you have just like a couple of monopoly platforms that are kind of algorithmically elevate. Facebook has, kind of done this research about, and not just Facebook, about the sort of the emotion that travels most readily through their networks is anger. And so, these are like kind of machines for producing anger and then monetizing it. And, they kind of have a right to do that, but they don't necessarily have a right to monopoly practices in doing that, and to kind of, to the level of dominance that they have. And so it's not, the problem isn't just that they're giving platforms to people, they're, boosting certain sorts of speech at the expense of others. And so, I mean, you're right that the gatekeepers have fallen away, and there was a time when, especially when I was here at Berkeley in the 90s, there was such, hope and optimism about the idea of, kind of the gates of information opening up and everybody being able to have a voice, and how this was going to be this wonderful thing for democracy. And it turns out it really wasn't. But, you can't, there's no way at this point to like reinstate those gatekeepers. I mean, again, it's why I keep coming back to the economics of journalism, right? Like, you're not going to create a culture anymore where, kind of a couple columnists have the power to define conventional wisdom for everybody else, or a couple of magazines have the power to like define the cultural conversation. Like, that has sailed, I think. What you can do is try to rebuild some of these institutions that both like provide jobs for people, because right now, I mean, the path, being a kind of content creator is probably a more reliable path than going to get a job at like as a beat reporter at a small local newspaper. That used to be a career path. That's not really one anymore. And so, people are responding to the incentives, and you can't completely change those incentives, but you can change them a little bit.
We have time for one last question. Ed?
Oh, thank you, Geeta. Now it's on. Michelle, thank you so much for this. It's a comfort to see that you're as good in person as you are in print.
Thank you.
My question is about the Times. Like many people here, I love the Times. I'm also baffled by the Times. And partly that's because outside of the national security realm, with the possible exception of the Federal Reserve, I can't think of a powerful institution that's covered as poorly or as scrutinized as rarely and as sometimes thoughtlessly as the Times. My question is, the space that you dwell in, which is a space where the Times entertains the play of ideas in the public policy realm. It may be the most powerful, most influential place on earth where that conversation takes place. And I have no idea how that conversation is conducted and who takes part in that. I'm not talking about the Times' own editorial positions. I understand there's a board, they do that. But I'm talking about the admission to that space of a variety of commentators, a variety of columnists and thinkers. How is that admission policy set? Who sets it and subject to what kinds of considerations?
Oh, God, I don't think I can. I mean, I don't think I know the answer to that question. I mean, my own experience of kind of coming to the Times was just of James Bennett coming and like plucking me up and, putting me in the, it felt like, kind of like if you win the lottery, you don't necessarily give good financial advice. It just felt, and so, I think that Katie Kingsbury, the new editor, she has done a huge amount to try to expand the ranks of columnists in particular. I mean, it's so much more diverse than it's ever been in the Times history, both in terms, kind of demographically, in terms of gender, in terms of race, and to some degree, I think also ideologically, when I was hired there, I was maybe the leftmost person, and I'm definitely not anymore. They've hired a bunch of people to my left, and they've also hired, really smart people to my right. But I think it's very hard to say sort of how they, decide who gets access to this precious real estate, because it's part of a bigger debate about what are the voices or what are the opinions that we think are worth considering, or within the bounds of kind of civilized debate. Like we've never had a pro-Trump columnist, in part because I can't think of a pro-Trump columnist who who's not either dishonest or have ideas that are considered kind of abhorrent. And so, you know, and that's a problem. It's a difficult problem to solve, because it does mean that like there's a huge swath of public opinion that we're maybe covering sort of anthropologically, you know, but we're not actually, you know, we don't actually have representations of it. But, you know, we're not going to have someone who argues on the pages of the New York Times that the 2020 election was stolen. But, you know, yeah, I think that how people kind of get admitted to that, I mean, to me, it feels very haphazard. So yeah, that's all I can say. I mean, I think that there is like really a good faith effort to, you know, be kind of constantly expanding the number of voices in the section, but some of it, maybe most of it, to me is always going to just be sort of luck.
So with that, join me in just thanking Michelle Goldberg for being here. Woo!